Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventure's Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Brooke Mitchell, and today's topic is Conservation Connect, Climate Change Challenges and Opportunities with Marcene Mitchell, Senior VP of Climate Change at WWF US, and Court Whelan, Chief Sustainability Officer of Natural Habitat Adventures. All right, to kick off the webinar, Marcene has provided me with a special video from WWF that sets the stage for today's discussion.
A sense of anticipation.
Wherever you're watching this in the world, I really hope you're set for a spectacular evening.
The arena is heating up.
Here we go.
Set. It's a European record to Greece. Unbelievable. What's happening with Mozambique? They got something. They got it.
France joins the race.
Pakistan, wow. Where did they come from?
It's now or never for Brazil. A national record. The place erupts.
More challenges coming up. All very similar in the way they attack. What a heat! A world record!
Cool. Well, that really is quite an amazing video.
And Court, to put it in context, we played this video during this year's Paris Olympics, which was all about countries coming together and breaking world records, right? And I think our point was that there's some records that we really don't want to break, right? And that we are breaking those records in the climate area. And so that's why this was such a really dynamic and poignant video, because you think about that in terms of all of these countries breaking these records in terms of changing the temperatures and the climate on our Earth.
Yes, well, excellent background. And yeah, I got to say, the first time that I watched that video, it kind of startled me and it gave me goosebumps and enlivened me all at the same time, which is, I think, kind of in a way the right space to be in when we're thinking about and talking about climate change. It is startling. It's kind of sobering, but there's a lot to be enlivened about because we're at this time in life where we truly still have time to do something about it. So in part, this conversation is going to cover those things. And let me just step back because we kind of had to shift things around a little bit with the video, but I'm going to re-ask my intro question to Marcene, which is, I know you come from the finance world to World Wildlife Fund and to climate. I'm just wondering if you could walk us through that journey, some of the decisions that got you to where you are currently, and also a little bit about what your work is presently.
Great, thank you. So what I was saying is that I didn't come from the environmental side. As you said, I came on finance, although I was doing economic development finance. I was working for the World Bank, whose mission really is to reduce and eliminate poverty. And so in working in that area, I was actually living in Peru and realized that there was no way we were going to achieve our goal of poverty reduction if we did not deal with the issue of climate change. In the Andean region, we were seeing the glaciers melting. We were seeing wars over water. We were seeing all of these pressures coming on because of the climate, and people were falling back into poverty. And so I realized while I wanted to fight poverty, I really needed to step back and see how can we do this. It has to be on a livable planet. It has to be in a place that supports everyone. And so now at WWF, the same challenge has come. So it's a conservation organization, one of the largest conservation organizations in the world, really working with iconic wildlife and iconic landscapes. But again, if we do not deal with what I call the monster in the room, climate change, we're going to fall back on any advances that we're making in these areas. We can't protect wildlife if there is drought or wildfires or storms that impact their areas. And so we need to both help wildlife and help our natural living through dealing with climate change. But we also need the natural world is a huge solution for climate change. So it goes both ways. We need nature to fight climate change, and we need to fight climate change to conserve nature.
Wow. Yeah, something you said really resonated. Well, the whole thing resonated, but something stood out in that to alleviate poverty, it has to be on a livable planet. And I think that is something that can be said about so many of the trials and tribulations of our world, is that in order to solve problem X, it has to be on a livable planet. And that's such a great way to put it. So you've kind of identified climate change as a threat to alleviating poverty. What are some of the biggest threats that climate change imposes on our world as you see it and as you know it?
So I think there are two really big threats. The first is water. And either with climate, we either have too much or too little, right? So you think about in Africa where they're, experiencing record droughts, or in the Middle East or Northern Africa, where they cannot grow food where they used to grow food, where their animals, cannot get water and are migrating away. So too little water or too much. And you think about the floods like in Pakistan, where a third of the country was flooded. Or if you're in the United States, we've just really experienced two massive hurricanes coming through, impacting us in areas that we never, ever expected to feel the impacts of hurricane. And those were with floods as well as the actual hurricane itself. So too much and too little water. That's one of the biggest impacts of climate. The second big impact is heat, right? That's the global warming part of it. And people don't realize that even as devastating as floods and hurricanes are, the number one killer of people really is heat, right? Property damage is the water, but the people is heat. And so we have to be really very aware of that. It also has huge economic impacts. If it's too hot to go out, you can't, there are certain jobs you won't be able to do, construction jobs or farming or anything that makes you have to go outside. Heat is really very, very bad. It also impacts things like in the oceans, fish migration, right? The waters are too warm, the fish move. And so you're used to getting your food and your sustenance from fish, and they've moved along. Or we're devastating the coral reefs. A lot of that issue has to do with heat and the warming of water. So I would say heat from both a human point of view, but also an ecological point of view, and water are the two biggest threats that climate change poses in the near term.
I want to talk a little bit about adaptability, something that I've learned, a little ways back, and I think something that most people don't know is that even if we were to stop all of our activities today, our negative activities of emissions and what we're contributing to the warming cycle right now, there's decades, if not centuries, built up behind us. And it's going to be like stopping a train on a dime. It's going to be rolling forward a little bit.
Right.
And I think we're going to have to adapt. We're going to have to, even if we can keep the climate from warming to 1.5 degrees or well below 2 degrees Celsius, there's going to be a certain amount of change that may be unavoidable. And I don't like to say that. I don't like to report on it necessarily. But adaptations and the like are going to be kind of a requirement for life on Earth, whether it's humans, whether it's wildlife. I'm wondering if you have learned about any adaptations or if there are any kind of man-made imposed adaptations that we are learning to create for wildlife or to offer and create for humans that might help with any sort of change that is inevitable for the human race.
Right. Well, Court, I think about it kind of in two ways. One is kind of on the level of society, and then there's also what we need to do as individuals to protect ourselves, our families, and our homes. So on the society level, I think one of the biggest takeaways I have is how do we use nature to be on our side and to help us with these changes versus working against nature, right? And so there's so many things that we can do to use, and we call these nature-based solutions, right? How do we use nature to solve some of these problems? And there are things that are very simple, like you hear in urban areas, there's something called the urban area heat dome effect, right? Where we don't have any trees or things of that sort and lots of concrete, and those areas are super hot. And as simple as bringing in greenery, bringing in trees and plants can lower the temperatures in those urban areas, and not to mention has a great psychological piece to it for us who love to be around nature. But we can also do things like using marshlands or everglades or the mangroves to absorb floodwaters, right? To reduce storm surges. Instead of trying to build big walls or levees that could break, we actually use nature. We allow floods to come in, but we have something to absorb them. We have something to slow them down. Or little things like oysters we can use to clean water, or other type of things that allow us to use nature in order to help us be more resilient, right? So I think that's one of the things that we need to think about and be clever about, and be, really thoughtful about bringing nature back into our lives, back into our cities and our urban areas and our rural areas in order to help protect us. On the individual levels, I think we need to start thinking a little differently about where we live, and we have to think about the climate change impacts. Before you would just buy a house, wherever, and you wouldn't have to think about floods or any of those, the river or any of those type of things that you're living by. And then especially, I think about heat. I mentioned that before, that heat is a great killer. And the reason is it's particularly vulnerable populations like older people or babies, young people, or sick people, that when the electricity goes out and it's very, very hot, right, people really cannot manage that kind of heat. So I would say that having this kind of resilience plan in place, particularly around heat, but around flooding, around other things, where our infrastructure, in these situations may be out and not there to protect us for a day or two or a week or 2 weeks. How do you manage that? And as you're thinking about where you're living, thinking about what impacts could come your way. So I think there's stuff we can do individually to protect ourselves, and there's things that we need to do as a society to protect ourselves. But I think, Court, you're right. We have to think about not only what we call mitigation, meaning reducing the emissions we're putting in the air and that are causing climate change, but we also need to protect ourselves because we will have these impacts for time to come.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's so poignant to bring this to a level of, like, people have to think about where they're going to call home and where they're going to live. I think a lot of folks expect, with the recent advents in technology, that technology is going to solve it. It's going to be some sort of solar pump. It's some sort of wind generated array, like things that are, sustainable in the energy space, that's just going to come in. And if we have the money and the ingenuity and the space to place these things, they're going to divert water and they're going to cool things down. But it's like, no, we might just have to move. Like really, like that's kind of the level of thinking that we have to think about it in a practical, honestly, very organic, very, full agency sense of
Right.
thinking. And I think it's an
And these
excellent.
are things we haven't thought about before, right? I mean, people, and they're buying their house, they're thinking, well, what's the school system? What's the transport, right, near me? Now you have to also take into consideration these other things. Well, what happens? Do I have any backup generation? Can I get to my elderly parents? Do they have a place to go if it's too hot? How do I, deal with flooding? Am I in a flood zone? What's my insurance going to be like if I'm at the coast, right? Our insurance is going to go, can I afford this house over time? It looks great now, but if I keep having these storms, I have to keep rebuilding, what's my insurance going to be like? These are questions that we're going to have to start asking ourselves as individuals in order to protect our families and our homes.
Yeah. And I think getting ahead of this whole thing, getting ahead, being as proactive as we can about climate change, is asking those questions now versus when it's too late, right? Because there's going to be a time in our near future, likely, where we're forced to think about those things. Like, we don't have a choice. It's going to be in front of our face. But yeah, so I do think that's part of climate resiliency, and part of the proactivity is thinking about those kind of difficult questions now. It's an excellent,
Right.
excellent point. So for those that missed the first couple of minutes of the presentation, I was mentioning that Marcene and I were on a Greenland expedition recently, very special expedition with Natural Habitat Adventures, and we got to know each other and got to meet a lot of Greenlandic people in East Greenland, which is a very, very unique place because it's like 5% of the entire Greenland population. Most are on the west near Nuuk. And it was, for me, talking about resiliency and adaptations, I found that the Greenlandic people had this very, very fascinating mindset on adaptation, particularly to climate change, actually. We may all know in the audience, but if you don't know, the poles are warming faster than anywhere else on Earth. The poles are warming monumentally faster. We're seeing huge swings from year to year. And the Greenlandic people have been seeing those effects for decades. And in fact, probably decades before the conversation of climate was so relevant and so household-ish. So I found that their mindset on adaptability, something that they've been having to go through for generations and generations, was particularly interesting and inspirational. So I'm wondering, Marcene, from your side of the Greenland trip, what was something that you learned and came away with? And doesn't, it could be climate related or not, just anything that you learned or impressions from the Greenland trip that, when we were quite literally interacting at ground zero of the climate crisis, the base of the Greenland ice sheet.
Right. Yeah, in fact, what's behind me is a picture I took of an iceberg that was in, one of the fjords that we were on. So it's an amazing landscape, right? And what really struck me was, the combination of how large and enduring nature is, in these landscapes, how long it's been there, these huge mountains, these, enduring areas, but at the same time, how constantly changing it was as well, right? And it really made me feel the people in such a harsh environment, how strong and resilient and creative they had to be in order to live in that type of environment, right? So little was wasted, in these communities. Everything was utilized that they had available to them. Every piece of, of equipment that they used or they created came from the seas and the earth and the animals. So it was really very impactful in that sense, and made me feel about how we are also, have those same, as human beings, we all have those attributes that we must constantly evolve and change, and we cannot be afraid of this type of change, right? That we must be grateful for all of the resources that we have, and that we need not to waste resources. We need to really kind of mimic how the earth works and how a lot of the indigenous people work in terms of utilizing everything that's at our disposal and wasting very, very little. And then I think that we also have to understand from nature, how strong and resilient we can be, and that we can use our creativity to tackle all these challenges that we see. So when you go into these places where you feel very small and you see how vast and incredible our planet is, our landscapes are, and how people have survived and been strong in those things, you bring back a little bit of that essence, that verve, that sense of can do. And so that's the things that I took away the most from my experience in Greenland.
Speaking of vastness, so I was able to actually get up on top of the Greenland ice sheet. As you know, I was part of a film team. We're doing a film on climate in Greenland and some topics on resiliency and adaptations, and that we hope and expect it to be released as part of Nat Hab films in Q1 of next year. But towards the end of the trip, I had that chance to get up there, and the vastness. Oh my goodness, to look at the enormity. I mean, it's a sea of ice in all directions. It's almost as if you're just looking at a white piece of paper, because it's just in every direction. And I have to say, an interesting thing, that the first thing that came to mind was actually hope, which is probably not what you think of when you think of being in ground zero of the climate change, when things are changing so rapidly. But the reason is, when we hear about climate change and the royal we, when we all hear about, not the royal we, all of us, when we all hear about climate change, we often hear about the doom and gloom. We hear about the negatives. We hear about the challenges. We see them. We see the bigger storms. We see the rivers that are swollen, that are flooding out rural town sites. But the one thing we don't often hear about is any sort of the reciprocal, of any sort of like kind of conservation wins around climate change. Or I shouldn't say we don't hear that. We don't hear enough of it. But one
Right.
thing we rarely do is we don't see that reciprocal. We don't see the positivity. And I have to say, when I saw that Greenland ice sheet, I saw what remains, which is truly like a massive, massive block of ice. It's an impressive geologic feature. It kind of was the first time that I got to put an image to any sort of optimism that I might have around climate. It was very surreal. And I think, I'm probably going to even talk about that more in the film because it was a pretty pivotal moment. But I thought it was really interesting that it's so hard to visualize what a non-changing climate looks like, other than just looking out and saying, oh, doesn't look like it's changing. But that image of seeing the ice sheet was so amazing for me. I just wanted to share that. So yeah, we're kind of talking about travel, and a bit of the elephant in the room, of course, is, should we be traveling to these places? Travel obviously has impacts. It has emissions. And I'm just wondering, when someone asks you whether we should be traveling and flying around in the midst of climate change, how do you respond to that?
Right. Well, it's a complicated question, and it's a very good question. So, air travel constitutes about, 2 to 3% of emissions, maybe up to 5 if you include the contrails. That's that water vapor that comes at the end of jets, that actually also impacts climate. But it's not like buildings, which are 60% of, say, emissions, right? It's a relatively small percent overall. But what it is the reason it's such a small percent is that 80% of people in this world have never gotten on an airplane at all, right? And that's changing. It's going down. More people are getting on airplanes, which is part of the problem. But truthfully, the issue is really one also of, equality and fairness. So a very small percentage of us, mostly living in northern and western countries, right, wealthy countries, are the most users of air travel, right? And in fact, it's one of the biggest emission footprint is from air travel for those of us who travel, frequently. So it's very few people causing, a lot of problems for folks who will never get the opportunity to have the benefit of air travel. And so that really becomes the question of, what is our responsibility as folks in terms of causing this problem to the rest of the world, right? The top 20 countries create 80% of the emissions, right? So that's one of the things that we have to look at. On the other hand, there's balance, right? If you just take travel for tourism, I mean, tourism is the largest service industry in the world, right? And during the pandemic, when nobody traveled, tourism just crashed, and crashed with it were, hundreds of thousands and millions, literally, of jobs. And in the area that an economic activity, and the area that you and I care about, ecotourism, it's even more dramatic an impact because ecotourism is really a way in which a lot of local communities get the resources in order to protect those natural environments, in order to protect those wildlife and those animal habitats, right? And without those sources of income, those communities are under pressure to actually use those natural resources instead of preserving them and saving them and conserving them. So, we really have to think about it. What I say to people is to be mindful about how you travel, right? Where you can substitute travel. So these days, we used to travel for conferences all the time. Now we can use, video conferences as a way. Or I live in Washington, D.C. I never take a plane to go to New York, right? I would take a train or a bus. I mean, that the difference in terms of emissions are dramatic, right? So for short trips, can you substitute? For business, can you again use different form of communication? And also, can you support right now? There's not a very great substitute for the diesel fuel that we use. It's one of those technologies we really don't quite have in terms of it being cost effective and as useful. But there are things called sustainable aviation fuels. And there are ways with many of the airlines where you can pay extra in order to support the use of sustainable aviation fuel. So if you have that ability to do that, then I would encourage folks to do that. So it's a complicated, I don't believe in flight shame. I believe that we have to be thoughtful and mindful of how we travel and where we travel and why we travel.
Yeah. Well, those in the audience that know me probably know which side of the coin I'm on. I'm a conservation biologist, but I think travel is one of the most powerful ways to save our planet, including wildlife and people and everything else. And yeah, everything you said, 100% agree with. I'll add something else is that I think, with any sort of impacts we have, there's always kind of like the positive and the negative, right? And so, as many of you in the audience know, Nat Hab reduces those negative impacts as much as possible. But I think what is important is that we as travelers, we as a travel industry, maximize the positive benefits as much as possible. So I think there's a bit of a responsibility on the traveler, on the travel industry, to look at that side as well and make sure that money is left in local economies. You're creating stakeholders and ultimately adding value to places and creating value for wildlife that may for centuries have only been valued as a dead animal. Trees may have only been valued for their timber, but now we're finding that wildlife and forests alive and well are worth anywhere between 5 and 5,000 times more alive. A single tree, a single lion, because of the tourism revenue. It dwarfs the next best thing for communities. And at the end of the day, this is a way for them to put food on the table. So I think it's quite fascinating there. Um, so yes, kind of moving on here, we are at a time of year with several major climate-focused conferences happening or have recently happened, international gatherings. Can you break down these conferences and these meetings to me and to the audience to kind of provide a little bit of context or maybe hierarchy or background on what are the key ones? Is there one or several that we should be paying more attention to? They all have acronyms. They all seem to be very important. They all involve, multiple organizations and or countries that seem to be very key players. Yeah, how do you sort through them all?
Right. Well, as you can imagine, there are hundreds of different climate conferences that happen all over the world all the time. But I guess two that I will talk about in general is there's something called Climate Week, and they have climate weeks in different places. So there's Climate Week in London, and in our part of the woods, my part of the woods, there's Climate Week in New York, right? And so that is not just one conference; it's a bunch of different conferences, different venues, and different sessions in New York. It happens around the same time as the UN General Assembly. So they're often governments that are in town. So people like that because they have a chance to be able to have some meetings with governments. But mostly, I would say the climate weeks are for businesses and civil society, right? It really is to discuss what kind of things businesses and civil societies are doing to address climate change, to make announcements of the newest things, but also kind of come together and discuss what are the challenges, what are the problems, what are the solutions that we're seeing, et cetera. And it's really been an explosion, particularly in the business world. I was amazed this week. We just had Climate Week in September in New York. And about how many businesses now, all the financial institutions were giving seminars and holding things, all of the consulting firms directed to these businesses. WWF, we did 2 days of programming where we shared some of the solutions that we're working on, some of the type of programs where we brought people together for roundtables to discuss how do we move faster, how do we do better, how do we scale up things. So that's one area that people should be aware of, the climate weeks in their regions, and having a chance for everyone to come. It's a little bit more accessible, right? You can you show up, most things are free, you kind of sign up and you're able to go in and talk to people. Everything from, rock stars to scientists are all sort of there. So that's really great, the climate week. The other big climate conference is the UN conference. It's called COP, the Conference of the Parties, which is basically a big way of saying all the member countries come together once a year to discuss their progress on climate change. So the heart of that conference is government to government negotiations and government to government reporting on what they're doing on climate and negotiating pledges of things that they will do going forward. Obviously, that's very, very important because so much of this is going to have to be done by governments, or with the incentives of governments, or with the regulations of governments, or pushing from governments. So governments coming together and making those pledges, commitments, and reporting what they're actually doing is key. This year, the COP is in November, and it is in Azerbaijan, Baku. It's been a little controversial because it's the second oil-producing state where the conference is held. And what's come around this conference of meetings of governments has been all the civil society. It's been a magnet, right? First, a lot of the young people come, right? They are able to kind of protest or tell what that they want. People who are have different issues, like the small island states who are very, very concerned about climate change because their land, their countries are literally sinking into the sea. Indigenous people, all sorts of the NGOs like the WWF, bringing in the issues of not only do we have a climate crisis, we have a biodiversity crisis, we have a crisis of nature, we have a crisis with oceans and food and fresh water. All of these things are starting to come around the meeting of these governments. So it's a very, very big event. It's happening once a year. And this one coming up is really focused on finance, right? So how do we pay for all of this? We're going to have to invest. We're going to have to invest in reducing our emissions. And as you pointed out, in terms of adapting and becoming more resilient, we have to pay for that, and particularly in the global south. So not only are the poles heating up the fastest, the next fastest is around the equator. So these are our countries that are in the south, and they are really feeling the impacts. If we think we feel it in the US or in Europe, the global south is really feeling the impacts, and they have had very little to contribute to the overall problem. So how do we help them become more resilient? How do we deal with damage and loss that they are having of their lands? And how do we help them get on a path of development that's not going to create the same kind of problems that we have had in the West in terms of the burning of fossil fuels?
So yeah, that's a great synopsis, and it's great and enlivening to know that countries and governments, businesses are thinking and talking about big things at that level, right? But when we think about the individual, it's been discussed certainly on our webinars, and it's a frequent topic of kind of like, what can the individual do? But I also kind of want to mix that with a little bit of a caveat, is that I think in a lot of ways, people tend to have almost like sustainability or climate change fatigue at times, which is dangerous. Like, apathy is the enemy here for all sustainability, including climate. So my question is, how does someone actively do something meaningful against climate change without just losing their mind at all the bad news all the time?
Right. Well, I think one thing, and this is one of the things that I have loved about my job over time working in climate, is that I see the solutions that we have, right? So a lot of people don't know. They get overwhelmed. They feel they only are focused on the impacts, and they don't know that we have about 80% of the solutions to climate change today. We have most of the technology that we need in order to combat climate change. We really have a lot of the money that we need. I mean, this is not going to, if we do it sooner, the sooner we do it, the cheaper it is, right? But because the cost of some of these technologies like wind and solar have come so far down, they're actually sometimes they're our cheapest alternatives. And in fact, it shows, right? If you look at how we're investing in new energy, most of our new energy investments are in renewable energy. They're not in oil and gas and coal. They're in renewable energy. And in the US, we have about 40% of our energy is clean energy. That's not all renewable. That includes wind and solar and hydro and nuclear, but it's 40%. It's a very good base. We need to double that, and we need to double that in the renewable space, right? And we need to do it quickly. But we have the technology to do that. We have the wherewithal. So that is very, gives you hope and a sense of optimism that we know some of the answers. This is not something where we don't know what to do or we don't have the technology to do it. But on the second part of your question about individuals, I think that if you take small steps and you do a few things, it changes you, right? You become the change. It doesn't mean you have to do something major and, mind blowing, but start where you are and you'll find that it takes you down this path. So for example, say you're a foodie and you just love food, and you like to cook or you like to go to restaurants. Well, maybe your way in is to focus on food waste, right? So 40% of what goes into our landfills is food waste, right? And that creates methane, which is about, can be up to 80 times stronger than carbon dioxide in terms of a greenhouse gas. So say you work on food waste in your house. You come up with ways that you're going to just put on a shopping list and you're only going to shop to that. You're going to freeze things. You're going to do all these things to reduce food waste. You start down that little path. It does make a difference. And it brings you on to other things. Maybe that brings you into thinking about, well, what's my diet like? And how does that impact? And what can I do to make small changes in my diet, right? And as you get down into these things, you find that you become the change and that you share that with your family and you share that with your friends and then they change. And as you change, you want to see these kind of changes. You become more aware and you find it kind of builds on itself. So it does make a difference. I mean, we need to do things such as a society, right? We need to stop burning fossil fuels, but there are other things that we can do as individuals that really do add up and make the change within ourselves.
Love it. Yeah, sustainability, especially that pertains to climate change, it's a learned thing. It's a learned behavior, and I often liken it to learning a language. So how do you start learning a new thing, or how do you start doing a new thing? Well, you do what's feasible to you in the moment. How do you start learning a language? You start with hello and goodbye and the things that are kind of easy, but then you start to memorize those things, and you start to get this sort of basic conversational fluency. And then as you learn those things, the harder things become more feasible, and so on and so forth. So yeah, I love that point, that starting somewhere is absolutely the key to all this. What's something that you think most people may not know about climate change?
Well, I think that they don't know, what I just said, that they don't know that we're making progress, right? We're not going fast enough. We have to accelerate and scale, but we are making progress. They don't know that we have the technology and generally the money to do this. It's not easy, right? And we have to think about, how do we do this? How do we unleash money from the private sector? Governments don't always have the money. How do we do it fairly, right? That's a big, big issue, so that those who have suffered the most from it and have the least resources to solve it, the burden doesn't come on them. So it's not that this is an easy thing to do. I don't think that at all. It's complicated. It's hard. We're trying to transform our, economy, but it is doable. And I think people don't know that I would say there are two big steps that we need to take, right? The first is that we need to stop burning fossil fuels. It is really the key of us turning, the clock on climate change. And we need to replace that burning of fossil fuels with renewable energy, right? So on the society level, that means building power plants based on solar and wind and maybe hydrogen in the future. At the individual level, that means, moving fossil fuels out of your life. And the second big step is electrifying everything with that renewable energy, right? So again, that means going into buildings and doing electric heat and electric lighting, using LEDs instead of incandescent bulbs, being more efficient. In your individual life, that might mean buying an electric car. That might mean buying an electric water heater or electric washing machine and dryer. And least I say, and I know this can be the very, very last thing you do, switching out your gas stove for an electric stove. And that's probably the hardest. People are like, not my gas stove. But at the end, again, bit by bit, pieces by pieces. But renewable energy for our energy system and then electrifying everything with that clean energy will get us so far down the road. There are other things we need to do, but those are the first two big steps.
Excellent. And final question here for you, Marcene, then we'll switch over to Brooke for some Q&A from the audience. But and you kind of already hinted at some things here, so feel free to repeat any points. But what gives you hope that we can overcome this thing?
I think what gives me hope is that you know, we are meant to do hard things in life. And we saw that in Greenland and the indigenous folks in Greenland of how resilient they were, how they were able to deal with the adversity of their very harsh environment. And so I feel like we as humans are built for that. We can take on these big challenges. I think the other thing is that when we put our mind to it, we are at the heart creative beings, right? And particularly, I'm boasting a little bit as Americans. I mean, one of the things that we do the best is innovation and creativity and being able to bring into the world things that people had never imagined, just years ago. And so I think that having those pieces puts us in a position where we really can take on this global challenge. And so that gives me hope. That gives me a sense that we can really manage this, and that we have, as I said, a good foundation. We just have to have the political will. We just have to have the social will. We just need to make climate change can't be a partisan division. It has nothing to do with politics. It really has to do with nature and our relationship with nature. It has to do with our ecosystem and really investing in ourselves, because the planet actually will survive us, right? It is us that we need to be afeared for, and our society and our ability to be not only survive, but to thrive in this world. So we have to do that. So that's what gives me hope. And I hope that everybody will look that there's so many ways in which they can be involved in this, both in their personal lives, but also as part of society. It's not just about activism. It's about how do you show up at your work, right? The companies are paying attention. They want good workers. And if you care about this is something they care about. Consumers, how do you show up as a consumer? Again, people are paying attention to what you buy. And so they want that they want to please you. You'll see so many ads for folks saying that they are, sustainable or they're green. And why are they doing that? Because they know you value that. The more you value that, the more that they will turn their ways to that. And politics, it doesn't mean, again, at the big level, it means showing up at the county courthouse when we're talking about bringing in renewables into your area. It's about climate justice and how you work with your neighbors to make sure everybody gets the benefits, and have the empathy for people who are afraid of change and who are going to be impacted if we move away from fossil fuels, right? Who've known that all their lives, having empathy for them and really making sure that they benefit as well. So I think we can do all these things, and I think if we do, we can actually have a brighter future, right? A different future, but a really one that is long lasting, and that we'll feel better about our lifestyles and how we relate to our precious and beautiful planet.
Beautifully put, Marcene. Well, with that, let's switch over to Brooke and take a few questions here.
That was a fantastic conversation. I was just sitting at the edge of my seat the entire time. We are getting some great questions in. Everybody, you are welcome. We'll take questions for like the next 10-ish minutes. So feel free. We're getting some really good ones. So please put them in here. This is a good one. Marcene, could you maybe talk a little bit about the trade-off between some renewable energies that might require fossil fuels to produce or land clearing like solar panels or anything like that. Could you maybe speak a little bit of your thoughts about the trade-off here?
Yeah, so WWF just recently did a paper with BCG, it's a big consulting group. And what we did is we looked at the comparison of a business as usual, a fossil fuel future, right, where we're still using fossil fuels, and we did one with if we turn to a renewable energy. And on almost all of the different impacts that we looked at, land use, cost, impact on wildlife, impact on water, et cetera, the renewable energy future had many less impacts than the fossil fuel future, right? So you've got to compare, like what does it look like if we go forward versus what does it look like if we go to a renewable energy future? And it was always less impact. Now, having said that it's less impact, that doesn't mean that it's no impact. And we're currently looking at, well, how do we reduce those impacts? So we're currently working on a paper that we hope to have published at the end of this year or beginning of next year about for example, as we expand renewables, what are the minerals and what's the mining that we need to do and what's the impact of that and how can we reduce that, right? And so part of that is how do we do that better? How do we use a circular economy instead of always just like extracting, using, and throwing away? How do we start looking at recycling and reusing minerals and materials? It's a really different mindset. It's not a mindset any of us grew up in, right? But I think we can get there, and that will make a huge difference in our footprint. So again, in summary, there's going to be some impacts of going for renewables. It will be much less than a fossil fuel future, and we can do even better by moving to a more circular economy.
I absolutely agree. That has been one of my top questions. It's like, why is this not more circular? Why are we not recycling more? Yeah, I completely agree with that. This is a great one too. Could you maybe speak on the progress of the United States so far in our movement towards renewable resources and commitment to climate change?
Yeah, again, we've made huge progress. And as I was saying earlier, that the vast majority of new investment in energy is in renewable energy versus in fossil fuel energy. Having said that, the United States, along with Russia and Saudi Arabia, are some of the biggest exporters and producers of fossil fuels in the world, right? And so a lot of that for us has come from gas and fracking gas. And so we have to find a path and we have to have a plan, which we don't right now, for how are we going to phase out fossil fuels. I think we all have to recognize, and there's been a lot of misinformation, there's been a lot of pushback from vested interest in this, of coming to the reality that we need to phase out fossil fuels, right? And honestly, if we can accept that reality, we can do it in a staged and well thought out way versus one day wake up and say, oh, we can't take the impacts anymore and just turn off the spigot. That would be catastrophic for our economy. But there are ways that we can move towards that greener future, and that's what we need to do.
Great, thank you for that answer here. I did write one myself, if you wouldn't mind me asking. Since you are a financial expert, there's been this uptick recently. I'm also in the conservation world and have been my career about biodiversity credits. As a climate specialist, can you speak on these? Is this something that WWF is interested in or that you have an opinion of or
Right.
anything? Biodiversity
So
credits?
it is a work in progress. These are new financial instruments that people are trying to do. The idea is that we need trillions of dollars. So right now we so underinvest in nature, right? And in order to really preserve our natural landscapes and our wildlife, we need to invest in nature. We need trillions of dollars a year. And right now we're kind of in the billions of dollars of years and not many. And so people are looking for different ways, market mechanisms, ways that we can get the private sector to unleash some dollars towards nature, towards climate. And so we've come up with these different instruments and these different markets. They're pretty nascent. They're early, and so they're imperfect. Let's just say, right? And we have our scientists who really want to make sure that if we're making these investments, that they actually have the impact that we hope to get out of it. Right? It doesn't make sense to throw money at something if it's not going to give you the impact. So that's what we're working on right now, making sure that these type of credits, be the carbon credits are what people know the most of, that they really produce the type of long-term impact, that they really reduce the emissions, they sequester the emissions that we want to have in the long term. So pay attention, keep watching, work in progress for sure, but it is something that we talk a lot about, of how do we get and unleash, trillions of dollars towards nature and towards climate.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I was just talking to somebody where they can't do tourism in their area and they have a critically endangered population of gorillas. And so this conversation about biodiversity credits is starting to be a big thing. And so I want to hear your opinion on them. So
Yeah,
thank you for
yeah.
that. We have a really good one here as well. So how do we get governments to move more quickly? How do we push them?
Yeah. Well, that's the question. The Conference of the Parties, that UN conference I mentioned, it's conference number 29. We've been at this for 29 years, right? And trying to get the governments to move. And as I said, I think the big problem with climate change is not a technological one. And even though it feels like it could be a money one, I think we could solve the money problem. It's really a political and social problem. You have to remember that a lot of governments, they are there for, 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, even 10 years. And the problems of climate are way beyond that, right? You have to make investments today that are for, decades out. And it's very hard for many governments to make those, to spend that money today for something that people view are going to benefit people, further away from them or in a different generation, et cetera. But I think two things. I think one, it's now about implementation. It's about getting things actually done. And a lot of the stuff that we need to get done is not absolutely at the national level. It often is at the local level. So I encourage people to not think about, how do we get, the White House or the Congress to do stuff? I mean, that's very, very important. But I also say, how do you get, your local county to do things? How do you get your city to do things? How do you get your state to do things? I sit on the board. I'm the chairman of the board of what's called the Montgomery County Green Bank. I live in Montgomery County in Maryland. And this green bank invests in very local things. It invests in putting solar panels on multifamily houses, or it invests in energy efficiency and electrifying, the school buses, right? Very, very local things. But that's where change can happen. And that's where you can feel agency and power, and like you can actually see a change coming. When you drive by your local firehouse and you see solar panels on the roof, it makes you feel like, yeah, there are solutions that are here. And so it's not that we don't need to work at the national level. We do. And we definitely need more money to come in. But I would also encourage people to work at their community level, right? To help their local county waste recycling, area. What are they actually doing? That makes you feel good, and it's in your community, and you can talk to your neighbors and you can talk to your family about it, and feel like you're really doing something, and you would be.
Speaking of talking to, I think this might be a fantastic last question to ask you. When we are out and about talking about this, and maybe especially to some people who might not believe in climate change or maybe a little bit on the fence, how do you recommend we go out and speak about climate change in a way that might not push people off, but maybe come and educate them a little further?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's so important that we take people for where they're at, right? And we engage them on things that they care about and relate it to, the climate. I mean, you find so many people who you would think were, okay, they're not interested, but, they live in rural communities. I mean, they're very attached to nature. They're very attached to a rural, lifestyle. And so how do you bring them what they value there and talk about climate in that sense, right? Or you've got people in the urban environment who don't really get to see nature very much. And they may think, well, that's for other people. That's really far away. How do you bring that, how they enjoy their local park? How nice it would be if there was more greenery in their area. How it would be so much better for their health if we had electric buses versus, other buses, or had less cars on the road. So I think it's relating to what people value and love and want to keep, and show them a brighter future, right? A lot of times I think when we communicate about climate, it is about what we have to lose, right? It's gonna, we're gonna be flooded out. It's gonna be terrible. It's gonna be this. And these are things that are true, but we don't talk enough about the vision beyond that. What if we actually solve this problem, right? What could life look like? What would it be like if we could, have more time to, get around in cleaner ways, to breathe better, to have more parks, to really enjoy nature, right? To eat healthier foods, those type of things. Bring that to people, because people really do care about that. And if you show them that vision, that is what could be, then I think people feel more attached and more willing to take action.
That was a beautiful response. Thank you so much. So, everyone, we have reached the top of the hour. So, Marcene and Court, I would love to turn it back to both of you, whichever order you would like to go in, for any last closing comments.
All right, me
Court?
first. I'm just kidding. No, I just wanted to start off by saying thank you so much, Marcene. It was a pleasure speaking with you throughout the Greenland trip. I learned so much then. I learned even more now, and I'm looking forward to many more rendezvous and opportunities to connect and learn from you. So thank you for today's opportunity.
Right. And I'd just like to say thank you as well. Thank you for having me. Thank you for spending some of your time to learn more about this subject. Please stay and follow us at WWF. Also, I'm on LinkedIn and Instagram, so please follow me, see what we're doing, this partnership that we have with Nat Hab and ecotourism, in terms of really exploring the beautiful outdoors. There's nothing to make you value the planet more than spending a little time in nature. I mean, it just really turns you around. Even if it's just one trip, special place, you'll realize what you're fighting for. So thank you so much, and it's great being here.
Yes, thank you both so much for taking the time to sit down with me and everybody who tuned in. And I'd like to thank all of you who tuned in and had this wonderful conversation with all of us. Join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.